In the middle of a Category 13 storm, the rain screaming against the windshield, my husband stopped the car. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He shoved me out onto the flooded road because his mistress was in labor and she mattered more. He sped off, leaving me alone in the darkness, soaked and shaking. 30 minutes later, he came back, and what he saw waiting there froze him where he stood. The storm had been building all afternoon, the kind that makes the sky feel heavy before the rain even begins. By the time we were on the highway, the wind was already howling, slamming against the car in violent bursts. Rain lashed the windshield so hard the wipers struggled to keep up, water pooling on the road faster than it could drain away. The radio crackled with emergency alerts, warnings about flooding and zero visibility. But he kept driving, jaw tight, hands clenched around the wheel. I remember gripping the door handle, my knuckles white, my heart racing with something more than fear of the storm. There had been tension between us all day, the kind that sat in silence, thick and unresolved. He hadn't looked at me once since we'd gotten into the car. His phone buzzed repeatedly in the cup holder, lighting up the dark interior. Each time it did, his foot pressed harder on the accelerator. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady over the roar of the rain. He didn't answer. Another buzz, another flash of light on his face. His breathing changed, shallow and urgent. Then abruptly he swerved on his shoulder, tires skidding slightly on the slick asphalt. The car lurched to a stop, hazard lights blinking uselessly against the sheets of rain. "She's in labor," he said finally, his voice sharp, impatient. "I have to get her to the hospital." The words hit me like the wind when the door flew open. Cold, violent, disorienting. "Get back in the car," I said instinctively as he climbed out, rain soaking him instantly. "This is insane. You can't." He came around to my side, yanked the door open, and grabbed my arm. His grip was hard, frantic. For a split second, I thought he was going to pull me closer, protect me from a storm. Instead, he shoved that I stumbled out onto the road, my shoes slipping on the flooded surface. The rain was blinding, the wind screaming in my ears. Before I could even process what was happening, he was back in the driver's seat. "I'll come back," he shouted over the storm. "I don't have time for this." The door slammed. The engine roared. And then he was gone, taillights disappearing into the wall of rain, leaving me standing alone on the side of the highway. For a moment, I couldn't move. Shock held me frozen as the storm battered my body from every direction. Water soaked through my clothes instantly, plastering fabric to my skin. The cold sank in fast, bone deep. Cars sped past, their headlights cutting brief, blinding streaks through the darkness before vanishing again. I tried to breathe, but panic tightened my chest. My phone was still in the car. My purse. Everything. All I had was myself and the storm. I took a step toward the guardrail, nearly losing my footing as a gust of wind shoved me sideways. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might tear free. I wrapped my arms around myself, teeth chattering, trying to think. Try not to scream. 30 minutes, he'd said. 30 minutes in a storm severe enough to shut down highways. 30 minutes on a flooded road with visibility near zero. 30 minutes abandoned like I was nothing more than an inconvenience in his way. As time stretched on, fear began to shift into something else. Not just terror of the storm, but a deep, searing clarity. Every ignored call, every late night, every excuse I'd swallowed down because it was easier than facing the truth. All of it lined up undeniable now. I wasn't a priority. I was an obstacle. The rain intensified, if that was even possible, stinging my face like needles. Somewhere in the distance, thunder cracked so loud it vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. I crouched near the guardrail, trying to make myself small, trying to shield my face from the worst of the wind. I thought about the irony of it all. Married, vowed to protect each other. And here I was, abandoned in a storm so violent it felt alive, while he raced toward another woman's delivery room. I don't know how long I stood there before I saw headlights slowing in the distance. Not passing, slowing. My heart leapt, a mix of dread and something dangerously close to hope. The car pulled up ahead of me, stopping at an angle on the shoulder. It was him, Relief and fury collided in my chest as he stepped out, scanning the road frantically. Rain streamed down his face, his expression tense, almost panicked. But the panic wasn't for me. It was for what he saw instead. Because the place where he'd left me was no longer empty. And in that moment, as he stared at the horrifying sight unfolding before him, I knew something with absolute certainty. This storm wasn't the worst thing that was going to happen that night. He stood frozen in the rain, headlights cutting through the darkness, eyes locked on the spot where he had shoved me out of the car. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Whatever he had expected to find, this wasn't it. The shoulder of the road was chaos. Debris scattered everywhere. A section of the guardrail was bent inward, twisted as if something heavy had slammed into it. One of the orange emergency cones lay crushed, its reflective strip flickering weakly in the flashing hazard lights of a stopped truck farther up the road. And in the center of it all, an abandoned shoe lay half submerged in rushing water. My shoe. For a split second, his mind refused to connect the pieces. He scanned the area wildly, rain streaming down his face, heart hammering. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice swallowed instantly by the storm. "Where are you?" No answer. He took a step forward, then another, shoes splashing into ankle-deep water. The storm surged around him, wind tearing at his clothes. His confidence from earlier was gone, replaced by something raw and frantic. He had come back expecting an argument. Tears. Accusations. Maybe me standing exactly where he'd left me, furious but alive. Instead, there was only evidence. Evidence that something had gone very wrong. A horn blared suddenly, long and panicked. He spun around just in time to see a semi-truck jackknife a few lanes over, its massive trailer sliding sideways before grinding to a halt. The driver leaned out the window, yelling something unintelligible, pointing toward the shoulder where my shoe lay. His stomach dropped. "No, no, no," he muttered, stumbling forward, searching the darkness beyond the guardrail. The rain had turned the ground into a river, water rushing downward toward a drainage culvert hidden by tall grass and debris. The wind howled so loudly it felt like the night itself was screaming. He dropped to his knees, fingers clawing at the wet ground, calling my name over and over now, desperation finally cracking through his voice. His phone buzzed in his pocket, vibrating insistently. He ignored it. Nothing mattered except the empty space where I should have been. In his mind, the images replayed in rapid, merciless flashes. The shove. My surprised gasp. The way I'd stumbled, struggling to keep my balance as the storm swallowed me whole. At the time, he hadn't looked back. He'd been too focused on getting away, on reaching the hospital, on being somewhere else. Now, standing in the aftermath, the weight of that choice crashed down on him with crushing force. Headlights appeared again in the distance, followed by flashing blue and red lights. Emergency vehicles. Someone must have called it in. He barely registered them pulling up, officers jumping out, shouting instructions into the storm. Hands grabbed his arms, pulling him back from the edge of the flooded shoulder. "Sir, you need to step back," someone yelled. "This area isn't safe." "She was here," he shouted back, his voice breaking. "I left her here. She was right here." The words sounded unreal as he said them aloud, like a confession ripped from him against his will. The officer's expression changed instantly. Not sympathy, something colder, sharper. "You left someone here in this weather." He didn't answer. He couldn't. His knees buckled, and if they hadn't been holding him, he would have collapsed again. Flashlights swept the area, beams cutting through rain and darkness. Paramedics moved quickly, efficiently, their faces grim. They searched along the guardrail, down the embankment, calling out my name. Each unanswered call tightened the knot in his chest until it felt like he couldn't breathe. Minutes dragged by like hours. Then one of the searchers shouted something. The beam of a flashlight froze on a shape farther down the slope, partially obscured by debris and water. He couldn't see clearly from where he was, but he knew. The storm hadn't just taken me. It had revealed him. As he watched the emergency crew rush toward that spot, reality finally caught up with him. Not the affair, not the lies, not the secrets he thought were contained and manageable. This was different. This was irreversible. And as the rain continued to pour, merciless and unrelenting, he understood with horrifying clarity that no matter what happened next, there was no version of this night where he walked away unchanged. Because storms pass, but some decisions leave damage that never does. The medics moved fast, but not with panic. That was what terrified him most. Panic meant urgency, chaos, the possibility of intervention just in time. What he saw instead was efficiency, the practice calm of people trained for outcomes they couldn't change. One of them raised a hand toward him without turning around, a silent signal to stay back. He tried to push forward anyway. "That's my wife," he shouted, his voice cracking. "That's my wife down there." An officer stepped in front of him, firm, unyielding. "Sir, you need to stay here. Stay here," as if standing still had ever been his strength. He watched helplessly as they reached the bottom of the embankment. Flashlights converged. Radios crackled. Someone knelt. Someone else shook their head slightly, a movement so small it might have meant nothing to anyone else. To him, it meant everything. The storm raged on, indifferent to the scene unfolding within it. Rain soaked through his clothes, plastered his hair to his forehead, blurred his vision until he wasn't sure whether the water on his face was rain or tears. His chest tightened painfully as the finality of the moment settled in. This wasn't something he could talk his way out of. This wasn't a fight he could postpone or deflect. This was the moment when every excuse he had ever made disintegrated under the weight of reality. One of the medics looked up, meeting his gaze from a distance. Their expression wasn't accusatory. It was worse. It was heavy with understanding. Understanding of how easily this could have been avoided. Understanding of how unnecessary it all was. The officer beside him spoke again, quieter this time. "Sir, were you the driver of the vehicle?" He nodded numbly. "And you left her here?" The words fell like a blade. He nodded again, barely able to form the motion. The officer exhaled slowly, then turned to speak into his radio. He used language that sounded procedural, detached. But there was no mistaking the shift. This was no longer just an emergency response. It was an investigation. Blue lights reflected off the rain-slick road, casting everything in harsh, strobing flashes. Cars slowed as they passed, drivers craning their necks to see, curiosity momentarily overriding caution. He felt exposed, stripped bare in front of strangers who knew nothing about his life except this moment. This moment would define him. His phone buzzed again, insistent. He finally looked at it. Missed calls, texts, the hospital, the woman he'd rushed to help, the life he'd prioritized minutes earlier. The irony was so sharp it made him nauseous. None of that mattered now. Whatever was happening down that embankment eclipsed everything else. The officer asked him to sit in the back of a patrol car while they continued their work. The door closed with a hollow thud that echoed louder than thunder. He sat there, soaked, shivering, staring out the fogged window as silhouettes moved through the storm. Time lost meaning. All he could think about was the shove. How casual it had felt in the moment. How quickly he dismissed the danger. How certain he'd been that everything would still be there when he came back. He had believed the world would wait. It never does. As the medics began the slow, careful process of moving a stretcher up the embankment, he pressed his forehead against the glass, breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He tried to remember the last thing he'd said to me, the last look on my face, whether there had been fear or anger or disbelief in my eyes. He couldn't remember. That realization gutted him more than anything else. The officer returned, opening the door. His expression was professional, controlled. "Sir," he said, "we're going to need you to answer some questions." The words were simple, but the meaning was seismic. Control had left his hands the moment he'd sped away into the storm. And now, there was no outrunning what came next. The questions began slowly, almost gently, as if giving him time to understand that nothing he said could undo what had already happened. Where had they been going? Why had they stopped? What exactly had occurred on the side of the road? Each answer tightened the noose he hadn't known was forming. He tried to explain it as urgency, panic, a moment of bad judgment. He used words like stress and emergency and fear. But every word collapsed under its own weight when measured against one unchangeable fact. There was no phrasing that softened that reality. An officer asked him if I had protested, if I had asked him not to leave. His mouth opened, then closed again. He remembered my voice, strained but steady, telling him to get back in the car. He remembered ignoring it. He nodded slowly. Another question. Did he believe the conditions were dangerous? He laughed once, a short, broken sound that startled even him. Of course they were dangerous. The storm alerts, the flooding, the visibility near zero. He had known all of it. He had simply decided it didn't matter. The realization landed hard. This wasn't an accident born of ignorance. It was a choice made with awareness. As the questioning continued, he noticed how the tone shifted. The officers were no longer just gathering information. They were building a timeline, establishing intent, documenting negligence. Every answer became a brick in a structure he couldn't see but could feel forming around him. He asked finally, his voice barely audible, Is she alive?" The pause before the answer told him everything. "She's been transported," the officer said carefully. "She's receiving medical care." It wasn't reassurance. It was procedure. They wouldn't let him see me. Not yet. Not at all, as it turned out. He was informed that, under the circumstances, contact wasn't appropriate. That phrase echoed in his head, hollow and heavy. Not appropriate. As if appropriateness was something he still had any claim to. He sat alone again, this time in a brightly lit room that smelled of disinfectant and rain-soaked fabric. The storm raged on outside, but it felt distant now, replaced by a different kind of pressure. The kind that comes when consequences finally arrive without disguise. He thought about the woman in labor, about the hospital waiting room he had abandoned mid-chaos, about the life he had tried to juggle without regard for balance or fallout. All of it felt absurd now, trivial against the reality pressing in from every side. When his lawyer finally arrived, summoned urgently in the middle of the night, the look on his face said what words didn't need to. This wasn't something that could be smoothed over. This wasn't a misunderstanding that would resolve quietly by morning. This was serious. The lawyer spoke carefully, advising him to stop talking, to wait, to let the process unfold. Process. Another neutral word that hid sharp edges beneath its calm surface. He nodded, numb, barely listening. Hours later, as dawn began to lighten the sky, the storm finally started to weaken. Rain softened. Wind slowed. The violence that had defined the night began to fade. But the damage was already done. The storm had passed. What remained was the wreckage. He sat there, exhausted beyond anything he had known before, realizing that the most dangerous moment of the night hadn't been the weather. It had been the decision he made when he believed he could leave and return without consequence. And now, there were no safe answers left. I remember the sound before anything else. The wind screaming so loud it erased thought. The rain hitting my skin like gravel, each drop sharp and cold. I remember trying to stand and realizing the ground beneath me wasn't solid anymore. Water rushed past my ankles, then my calves carrying small pieces of debris with it, tugging at my legs like it wanted to pull me down and away. I remember shouting his name once. Just once. Not because I expected him to come back immediately, but because part of me still believed, stupidly, that he wouldn't leave me there. That this was some kind of nightmare misunderstanding that would correct itself any second. When the taillights disappeared, that belief shattered. I tried to move toward the guardrail, thinking higher ground meant safety. My foot slipped, and I went down hard, the breath knocked clean out of my chest. Pain shot up my side, sharp and blinding. Water surged around me, soaking my hair, my clothes, my mouth. I tasted metal and rain and fear. Time stopped behaving normally. Seconds stretched. Thoughts came in fragments. Don't panic. Stay awake. Get up. My body didn't cooperate. Every movement felt heavier, slower, like the storm itself was pressing me into the ground. I remember thinking about how quiet it would be if I stopped fighting. That thought scared me more than the storm. I clawed at the wet ground, fingers numb, nails scraping against gravel. The current dragged me sideways, toward the slope beyond the shoulder, toward darkness I couldn't see into. I screamed then, not words, just sound, raw and instinctive. Something hit my leg. Hard. I don't know what it was. Maybe part of the guardrail. Maybe debris from another car. Pain exploded, white and overwhelming, and I cried out again. My body finally gave in, sliding down the embankment, water carrying me with terrifying ease. I remember the cold most of all, how it crept inward, numbing everything. My thoughts slowed, my vision blurred. The storm became distant, like I was underwater. I knew, dimly, that this was bad, that people don't last long like this. And in that darkness, something strange happened. I stopped thinking about him, not out of anger, out of clarity. I thought about my life before this moment, about all the times I'd ignored that tight feeling in my chest when he dismissed me, all the nights I'd waited for him to come home while telling myself it didn't matter, all the moments I convinced myself love meant endurance. Lying there, half submerged and shaking, I understood something with brutal certainty. If I survived, nothing would ever be the same. I don't know how long I was there before the lights appeared. Maybe minutes, maybe longer. Flashlights cut through the rain, beams bouncing wildly as voices shouted my name. Hands grabbed me, firm and steady, pulling me back from the water. I coughed violently, water pouring from my mouth, my body racked with shivers. Someone wrapped a blanket around me. Someone else kept talking, calm and reassuring, anchoring me to the present. I clung to those voices like lifelines. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, pain flared again, reminding me how much damage had been done. But beneath the pain, beneath the shock, there was something else. Relief. Not because he'd come back, but because I was alive. And as the ambulance doors closed and the storm faded behind us, I stared up at the ceiling and made a promise to myself I would never break. No matter what happened next, no matter what he said or did, I would never again stay with someone who could leave me to die. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the comforting kind, but the controlled stillness of a hospital room where every sound is measured. Machines hummed softly beside me. A monitor beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. The storm felt like a memory pressed behind glass, distant but sharp. My body hurt everywhere. Not one specific pain I could isolate, but a deep, aching soreness that reminded me I had been somewhere my body wasn't meant to survive. My leg throbbed, wrapped tightly in bandages. My ribs burned every time I breathed too deeply. My throat felt raw, scraped clean by coughing and fear. A nurse noticed my eyes open and immediately came to my side, her voice calm and practiced. She told me where I was, what had happened, how long I'd been unconscious. Hypothermia, impact injuries, severe bruising, a fracture that would take time to heal. She spoke gently, but she didn't soften the facts. I nodded slowly, absorbing it all, my mind still sluggish. Then I asked the question I already knew the answer to. Did he come? The nurse hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Long enough. He's not permitted to see you right now, she said carefully. I closed my eyes. I didn't feel disappointment. I didn't feel relief either. What I felt was distance. Emotional, complete distance. Like the version of me who had loved him belonged to a different lifetime. They moved me later that day to a quieter room. A social worker came in, followed by a doctor, then a woman who introduced herself as an advocate. She explained my rights slowly, clearly. What had been documented? What witnesses had reported? What options I had going forward? Options. That word felt foreign. For so long, I had lived as though my only option was endurance. Adjusting, making things easier so nothing would explode. Lying in that bed, bruised and stitched and shaking, I realized how small I had made my life trying to keep someone else comfortable. They told me the police had taken statements, that the situation was serious, that what happened wasn't being treated as a misunderstanding. They didn't pressure me. They didn't need to. The facts spoke loudly enough. I stared at the ceiling after they left, thinking about how close I had come to disappearing entirely. How easily my story could have ended on the side of a flooded road, reduced to a headline or a footnote. The thought made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with injury. A few hours later, my phone was brought to me, dried miraculously intact. Missed calls filled the screen. Messages stacked on top of each other, his name flashing again and again. Apologies, panic, confusion, promises that arrived too late to matter. I didn't open them, not because I was angry, because I already knew what they said. That night, alone in the hospital room, I cried for the first time since the storm. Not loud, not dramatic. Silent tears that slid down into the pillow as I lay there staring at the dim glow of the hallway light under the door. I cried for the woman I had been before that night. The one who believed love meant staying. The one who thought being chosen once meant being protected always. The one who hadn't believed she could leave. And then, slowly, the crying stopped. In its place was something steadier. Resolve. I knew, with a clarity I had never experienced before, that surviving the storm wasn't the miracle. The miracle was waking up knowing I would never accept that kind of danger again. When morning came, sunlight filtered softly through the window. The storm was gone, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively calm. I watched it quietly, feeling the weight of everything that had changed settle gently but firmly into place. He would beg. He would explain. He would say he hadn't meant it to happen like that. But intention didn't matter anymore, because the truth was simple. He had pushed me out of the car, and I had survived. The papers arrived quietly, slipped into my hospital room without drama or ceremony. A nurse handed them to me with a careful look, the kind people use when they don't want to say too much but don't want to lie either. She told me I didn't have to look at them right away, that I should rest, that everything else could wait. I looked anyway, not because I was eager, but because I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed proof that what I felt inside me had a real-world shape, that this wasn't just pain talking, that the line I felt so clearly had been crossed in a way that couldn't be uncrossed. Emergency protective orders, temporary separation, documentation of the incident, language that was calm, factual, unflinching. There were no dramatic adjectives, no emotional appeals, just a clear record of what had happened and what would happen next. Reading it didn't hurt the way I expected. It grounded me. The doctor came in shortly after to explain my recovery timeline. Weeks before I could walk without assistance. Months before my body felt fully like mine again. Physical therapy, follow-ups, adjustments. The first time he was allowed to see me after the storm, it wasn't in person. It was through a legal notice delivered to his workplace. A thin envelope that carried more weight than any argument we had ever had. Inside were restrictions, timelines, and language that stripped away the version of himself he still clung to. He read it 3 times before it fully registered. No contact, mandatory statements, pending charges, immediate separation of assets. He sat at his desk long after everyone else had left, staring at the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something softer. They didn't. Legal language doesn't negotiate. It records. He had told himself the storm had been an accident, that the situation had spiraled beyond his control, that once emotions cooled, things would return to normal. But normal had disappeared the moment he put his hands on me and chose to drive away. His mistress had given birth that night. Healthy baby, complicated delivery. He was there for it. He held the child. He smiled for photos he didn't realize would never matter. By morning, the gravity of what he'd done reached him in a way no confrontation ever could. Because the celebration had ended, and consequences had begun. When he tried to call me again, the call didn't ring. When he sent messages, they bounced back unread. When he showed up at the hospital demanding answers, security escorted him out without discussion. He was no longer someone with access. That loss rattled him more than the threat of charges. Access had always been his safety net. The belief that no matter what happened, he could explain, charm, or push his way back into the center of things. Now, every door closed automatically. Not with anger, with policy. He went home to an empty house that smelled faintly of rain and silence. My things were already gone. Not everything, just what mattered. Documents, clothes, photographs. The absence felt intentional because it was. He sat on the edge of the bed that night, holding his phone, rehearsing apologies that had no recipient. He realized then that remorse without accountability sounds identical to self-pity. And no one was listening anymore. The investigation progressed quickly. Witnesses came forward. Dashcam footage surfaced. Emergency responders documented timelines. Everything pointed back to the same moment. The shove, the storm, the decision. There was no escaping it. Friends distanced themselves quietly. Not dramatically. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations grew awkward. People didn't ask questions because they already knew enough. Reputation doesn't collapse in an instant. It erodes the same way trust does, through undeniable facts. Meanwhile, I focused on healing. Physical therapy was painful, slow, humbling. Every step reminded me of how close I'd come to losing everything. But each session also reminded me that my body was still mine, that I was reclaiming it piece by piece. Emotionally, something had shifted permanently. I didn't replay arguments. I didn't second-guess decisions. Survival has a way of clarifying priorities. I slept deeply for the first time in years, not because things were easy, but because they were honest. When the charges were formally announced, I wasn't surprised. I felt steady, not vindicated, not relieved, just grounded in the knowledge that what happened mattered enough to be taken seriously. He fell apart privately, not because he missed me, because he had lost control. That distinction became clear in everything he did afterward. His fear wasn't about my pain. It was about his exposure, his narrative, his future. I didn't attend hearings. I didn't watch from the gallery. I let the system handle what I no longer needed to carry. My role was not to punish him. It was to protect myself. The storm that night had taken so much from me, but it had also stripped away illusion. And once illusion is gone, there's no going back. Recovery didn't look the way people imagine it does. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no dramatic moments where everything clicked into place. Healing came quietly, in increments so small they were easy to miss unless I paid close attention. It came in the form of mornings where I could sit up without pain, afternoons where I could take a few careful steps without gripping the wall, evenings where my mind didn't race through worst-case scenarios before sleep, that I moved into a small, temporary place while my body healed. It wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. It was safe, dry, and calm. The first night there, I lay in bed listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic, and for the first time since the storm, my chest didn't feel tight. The quiet didn't scare me. It soothed me. Friends checked in, but they didn't hover. They understood that I needed space to process things in my own time. They brought food, helped with errands, sat with me without forcing conversation. That kind of support felt different from what I'd known before. It wasn't conditional. It didn't ask me to minimize what had happened or move on faster than I was ready to. Physical therapy became part of my routine. Painful, exhausting, sometimes frustrating. But every small improvement felt like reclaiming territory that had been taken from me. Each step forward reminded me that my body had endured something extreme and survived. That knowledge changed how I related to myself. I wasn't fragile. I was resilient. Emotionally, I stopped questioning my memories. For years, I had second-guessed my perceptions, wondering if I was overreacting, being too sensitive, expecting too much. The storm erased that habit completely. There was no ambiguity about what had happened. I trusted myself again, fully and without hesitation. I thought often about how close I had come to staying in that marriage forever, convincing myself that endurance was the same thing as strength. Lying in that flooded darkness had burned that relief out of me. Strength, I realized, is knowing when to leave. When to choose yourself, even if it costs you everything familiar. I didn't rush into a new life. I didn't feel the need to prove anything. I took things slowly, deliberately. I made decisions based on how they felt in my body, not how they looked on the outside. If something tightened my chest, I stepped back. If something brought calm, I leaned into it. People sometimes asked me how I could move forward without anger consuming me. I told them the truth. Anger had its place, but it wasn't where I lived anymore. Fear had taught me enough. I didn't need to carry rage to remember what mattered. As my strength returned, so did my sense of possibility. I began to imagine a future that wasn't shaped around someone else's unpredictability. A future where safety wasn't something I hoped for, but something I built intentionally. That shift was subtle, but profound. I learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. I learned how to say no without explaining myself. I learned how to recognize red flags early, not because I was hypervigilant, but because my standards had changed. Survival recalibrates what you tolerate. There were moments when memories of that night surfaced unexpectedly. The sound of heavy rain, the glare of headlights, the feeling of being pushed without warning. When those moments came, I didn't fight them. I acknowledged them, reminded myself where I was now, and let them pass. Trauma loses power when it's met with awareness instead of fear. I never reached out to him. Not once. There was nothing left to say. Closure didn't come from conversation. It came from consistency. From waking up each day in a life that no longer required me to be on edge. From realizing that I didn't miss him, I missed the version of myself I had abandoned trying to make things work. That version of me was gone now. In her place was someone steadier, quieter, more discerning. The storm had taken my sense of certainty and replaced it with something better. Trust in myself. Trust in my ability to act when things become dangerous. Trust in my right to leave. I didn't rebuild my life to spite anyone. I rebuilt it because I survived. And survival, when honored properly, becomes the strongest foundation there is. The realization didn't come to him in a courtroom or during a heated exchange. It didn't arrive with handcuffs or shouted accusations. It came quietly, the way truth often does when there's nothing left to distract from it. It came the day he stopped being angry at me and started being afraid of the life he had created for himself. He sat alone in a borrowed apartment, the kind furnished with mismatched pieces and temporary comforts, staring at a wall that held no photographs. The storm had been weeks ago, but it lived on in his mind with a clarity that refused to fade. Every time rain hit the windows, his body tensed. Every emergency siren made his chest tighten. He couldn't escape the memory of that night because it was the night his power over the narrative ended. He tried, at first, to tell himself I would eventually soften. That time would dull the edges. That once the legal process slowed, once the public attention shifted, I would reach out. He imagined conversations where I listened quietly while he explained himself, where my silence meant I was considering forgiveness rather than having already decided against it. What finally broke that illusion was something small. A mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing me out one afternoon. I was walking slowly but steadily, a slight limp still visible, talking with someone and laughing. Not performatively, not loudly, just genuinely. The description unsettled him more than any accusation ever could have. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't waiting. I was living. That was the moment he understood I wasn't coming back. Not to argue, not to negotiate, not to punish him with distance. I had already moved beyond the need for engagement. The door hadn't been slammed in anger. It had been closed carefully, deliberately, and locked. He replayed that night again, searching for a point where he could have stopped himself. A moment where a different choice might have led to a different outcome. He saw it clearly now. It had been right there when he opened the car door and decided his urgency mattered more than my safety. That was the moment everything changed. He had told himself he would come back, that it was temporary, that 30 minutes wouldn't matter. What he hadn't understood was that some actions don't measure time the way intentions do. They measure consequence. The legal consequences continued to unfold, but they were no longer the center of his fear. What haunted him was the permanence of my absence. The fact that I had rebuilt my life without reference to him. That I didn't orbit his regret or respond to his remorse. I had removed myself completely. He thought about reaching out one last time, not to apologize, but to confirm what he already knew. He didn't. Somewhere deep down, he understood that reaching out would only prove how little he had learned. Silence was the only thing he could offer that didn't cause further harm. For me, that day passed without significance. I didn't feel a shift or sense a closure event. I was too busy living inside the life I had built. My days were structured around healing, work, quiet moments of joy. I no longer measured progress by how far I was from him, but by how close I was to myself. That I noticed how my body responded differently to the world now. Loud noises startled me less. Rain no longer sent my heart racing. My trust in my own instincts had returned fully, and with it came a sense of ease I hadn't known before. I moved through life without bracing for impact. When people asked about him, I answered simply, briefly, without emotion, not because I was suppressing anything, but because there was nothing left to unpack. The story had already taught me what I needed to learn. I understood now that survival isn't just about getting through something. It's about what you refuse to normalize afterward. I refused to normalize being discarded. I refused to normalize danger disguised as urgency. I refused to normalize love that required me to risk my life. That refusal shaped every decision that followed. The storm that night had been violent and terrifying, but it had also been honest. It stripped everything down to its most essential truth. In that truth, I saw exactly who he was when pressure arrived, and I saw exactly who I became when I stopped accepting it. He realized, far too late, that losing me wasn't the punishment. Living with the knowledge of what he had done was. And I didn't need to be present for that lesson to last. Surviving didn't make me fearless. It made me honest. Honest about what I could endure and what I should never have been asked to endure in the first place. That distinction mattered more than courage ever had. Courage had kept me in places that were slowly killing me. Honesty set me free. In the weeks after I began walking without assistance, people praised my strength as if it were something I'd consciously chosen, as if resilience had been a personality trait instead of a response to danger. I accepted their words politely, but inside I knew better. Strength wasn't what pulled me through that night. Instinct did, and instinct doesn't negotiate. It acts. I stopped romanticizing what I had lived through. I didn't call it a test or a lesson wrapped in suffering. I called it what it was, a warning I survived. Naming it clearly allowed me to put it where it belonged, in the past, not on a pedestal. What surprised me most was how my sense of worth recalibrated itself. I no longer tied my value to patience, loyalty, or sacrifice. Those things had once felt noble. Now they felt conditional. My worth stopped being something I proved through endurance and became something inherent, non-negotiable. That shift changed how I moved through the world. I didn't rush to fill silence with explanations. I didn't justify my boundaries. I didn't overextend to make others comfortable. When something felt wrong, I trusted that feeling without needing external confirmation. Survival had sharpened my internal compass in a way comfort never had. I began to notice how often people mistake tolerance for love, how easily neglect is excused when it's framed as urgency or ambition or stress. I saw those patterns clearly now, not just in my own story, but everywhere. And I felt a deep, quiet commitment form inside me. I would never again confuse being chosen with being protected. The life I built after the storm reflected that commitment. I chose environments where care was mutual, where accountability wasn't optional, where emergencies didn't require bargaining for attention. Those choices weren't dramatic. They were deliberate. Some nights, when rain hit the windows hard enough to wake me, I would pause and breathe through the memory instead of pushing it away. I reminded myself where I was. Safe, dry, alive. The fear would rise briefly, then recede. Trauma loses power when it's acknowledged without control. I stopped wondering if he understood the magnitude of what he had done. Understanding wasn't necessary for my healing. Consequences existed regardless of comprehension. That realization freed me from the burden of wanting recognition or remorse. I also stopped telling the story in full, not because I was ashamed, but because it no longer defined me. I shared it when it served a purpose, when it helped someone else name a danger they were minimizing, when it reminded someone that leaving can be an act of self-respect, not failure. Each time I chose myself without guilt, the lesson deepened. Survival taught me that love is not proven in crisis by words shouted into the wind, but by hands that don't let go in the first place. It taught me that urgency does not excuse abandonment, and it taught me that the body keeps score long after the mind has made excuses. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. And clarity, once earned, is something you protect with your life. By the time my body fully healed, the storm no longer lived in my muscles. It lived in my memory as a boundary, a line I would never step back over. I didn't measure recovery by scars fading or pain disappearing. I measured it by how naturally I protected myself without thinking, by how instinctively I walked away from anything that felt unsafe, dismissive, or careless with my life. I stopped asking what might have happened if things had gone differently that night. If he had slowed down, if he had listened, if he had chosen me. Those questions belonged to a version of myself who still believed love was a negotiation. I didn't live there anymore. The truth was simpler and heavier than any hypothetical. When pressure arrived, he chose speed over safety, desire over duty, himself over me. The storm didn't create that truth. It exposed it. I carried that clarity into everything that followed. When I signed the final papers, my hand didn't shake. There was no dramatic release, no flood of emotion, just a quiet sense of alignment. The ending matched the reality. That was enough. Closure doesn't always come with relief. Sometimes it comes with accuracy. I rebuilt my life with intention rather than urgency. I didn't rush toward happiness. I cultivated stability. I chose routines that honor my nervous system. I chose people who didn't require me to explain why safety mattered. Those choices compounded, slowly forming a life that felt grounded instead of reactive. Occasionally, people would ask how I found the strength to leave. I corrected them gently. I didn't find strength. I found a limit. And when that limit was crossed, my body acted before my fear could talk me out of it. That wasn't bravery. That was survival doing its job. I no longer tell myself stories that make danger palatable. I don't soften memories to make others comfortable. I don't minimize harm to preserve relationships that cost too much. The storm taught me that clarity is kinder than endurance, and honesty is safer than hope. When rain falls now, I notice it differently. I listen without bracing. I watch without remembering the road, or the shove, or the darkness. The storm lost its power over me the moment I stopped tying it to him. It became weather again. Loud, temporary, passing. What stayed was the lesson. I learned that love doesn't ask you to disappear when it's inconvenient. That commitment doesn't abandon you in danger. That urgency doesn't justify cruelty. And that anyone willing to gamble with your life has already forfeited the right to stay in it. The horrifying sight he returned to that night wasn't just the aftermath of the storm. It was the consequence of his choice made visible, a reality he could no longer outrun. For me, the storm marked an ending I didn't mourn. It marked the moment I chose myself without apology. And that choice, once made, never needed to be justified again. And here's the part no one talks about. The storm didn't end when the rain stopped. It ended when I stopped apologizing for surviving it. He will always remember that night as the moment everything went wrong. I remember it as the moment everything finally made sense. Because when someone shows you who they are under pressure, believe them. When they choose speed over safety, believe them. When they leave you in the dark and promise they'll come back, don't wait to see if they do. I didn't survive that storm to stay silent. I didn't crawl back from the edge to shrink myself again. And I didn't walk away so I could be chased. I walked away so I could live. And the truth he has to carry for the rest of his life is simple and unchangeable. The storm didn't destroy my marriage. It revealed why it had to end.